First, let me say that I'm not speaking on higher education. I've been asked to speak on human capital development, but I'll be focusing on, as you'll see in my presentation, on basic education, which I think is, in some senses, fundamental to what the sort of outcomes we see at the other levels of education. 40 years since graduation. You guys are quite old, I must say. But I speak to myself as well. This year marks my own 40th year post-call as a lawyer. I graduated at the University of Lagos just a year earlier than you, 1978, but I was in law school in 79. So I was in youth corps with colleagues such as Ambassador Dipeolu, who is the economics advisor for the president, the president's economic advisor. But I'm especially pleased to have this opportunity to share thoughts with a room full of successful peers, professionals, men and women of commerce who studied economics formally and went on to achieve great heights in various professions. No one needs to restate here the importance of the economist. It is, as I'm sure you'll agree, second only to the legal profession. But quite seriously, it is the stock of economists that form the pool of talent from which our accountants, bankers, financial experts are mostly drawn. So they play an equally important role in framing the discourse on national economic policy, teaching the next generation of economists, and drawing up national development plans and strategies. I have found that as chair of the National Economic Council and our economic management team, that economists are invaluable. Of course, not only do I have a very strong team of economists who support the work that I do, but also I find that economists, at least possibly some of the most realistic individuals that we have in our midst most of the time. The reason is that they're usually wrong in there, and I think that they've discovered that these things are never precise. So they become humbler, I believe, in their approach to life generally. But as I said, they provide the most important resource, which is at least a scientific way of looking at some of the issues and problems that we have. And you cannot do without economists when you're thinking of the economy anyway, or thinking of national planning generally. I was to speak on the broader subject of our plans for human capital development in Nigeria. And this is a huge topic, and I doubt whether we'll be able to do much beyond barely scratching the surface were we to go through all of those issues on human capital development. So I thought this morning might be more usefully spent focusing on one aspect of human capital development, so that we can hopefully drill deeper, perhaps if we have an opportunity to interact a bit in the question in the interactive session. And so that aspect is education, especially the interface between our national growth objectives and the educational system. And I want to concentrate on basic education, meaning education in the first 9 years of a child's life. The conventional wisdom is that growth depends on productivity, which itself results from getting right the appropriate mix of labor, capital, and technology, which is human capital. But taking this perspective, it stands to reason that with its huge population, Nigeria's growth potential lies more in its people than in oil and gas. So the examples of China, India, Brazil even, and Indonesia also show the growth possibilities if we get human capital right. So really, at the root of the problems of development that we have is human capital. What is the quality of those that do the productive business? What's the quality of those who rely on for economic growth? But perhaps more compelling is the prospect of being, by 2050, as we're told repeatedly, the world's third largest country by population, without a sound plan for education of 70% of the population, which is the young people. So if we don't have a sound plan for the education of 70% of the almost 400 million, slightly over 400 million people that we expect, and where we'll be the third largest by population in the world, then that would be a tragedy indeed. This is why, in addition to the federal government's visible efforts in the real sector, as well as in hard and soft infrastructure, our focus in the next 4 years would be to lay and implement a relevant and dynamic educational plan for Nigeria. Relevant meaning capable of providing job and entrepreneurial skills for an increasingly globally competitive job market. But the challenge we must immediately acknowledge is that the federal government's role in the first 9 years of a child's life is slight. And this is because it is primarily the constitutional role of the states and local governments to deal with that first 9 years of education. But we consider the matter, when I say we, I refer to the federal government, consider the matter of basic education a matter of national emergency. Consequently, it is the role of the federal government to guide, to inspire, and to coordinate and co-fund and also co-implement the basic education strategy. Improved educational outcomes are crucial to our overall strategy to end extreme poverty, reduce inequality, and remain on the path of sustainable growth. Everybody talks about poverty. People say, oh, Nigeria is now poorer, well, has larger numbers in absolute terms of the poor than India, which used to have larger numbers than ourselves. But the question, of course, is that poverty doesn't happen overnight. Poverty figures don't happen in a year or 2 years. In 2012, where the last household study on poverty was done, we were earning our highest in terms of oil earnings. And poverty figures at the time stood at 112 million Nigerians living in extreme poverty. But because we did not take a holistic approach to dealing with the questions of poverty, beginning with education and the other indices of human capital development, of course, the situation worsened. It improved slightly, then worsened. And that is exactly what we get if there is no deliberate plan for improving human capital development, because that's really the fundament of the problems we have with poverty. But while the arguments rage as to how crucial education is, and there are all sorts of arguments as to whether or not education actually addresses the questions of extreme poverty, there's no question that illiteracy or lack of access to quality education is very closely associated with poverty. The UNESCO Global Education Monitoring Reports and the Education Commission's Learning Generation Report. The Education Commission, I'm sure some of us are familiar with that, the commission that was established to just look at problems of global poverty and education at the same time. And some of their findings are quite interesting. The first is that they say that one of their first findings is that education actually reduces poverty, and that it could reduce poverty by as much as 30% just by improving learning, just by improving learning skills, just by changing the way that we teach, just by improving quality of teacher education. We could actually reduce poverty by up to 30%. Education, they also say, increases individual earnings, as it increases earnings by as much as 10% for each additional year of schooling. So for every additional year that the person actually goes to school, earnings will actually improve by about 10%. Indeed, they find that by just an additional $1 invested in schooling, earnings can increase by as much as $5 in low-income countries. And of course, we're focused on low-income countries. They also do that education reduces economic inequalities generally. It was found that workers from poor and rich backgrounds, if they receive the same education, the disparity between the two could decrease by as much as 39%. Just to give an example of that, we have a school, it's a voluntary school done by contributions from some friends and colleagues in Maiduguri, where orphans, a group of orphans, they're in that school, of course, were randomly picked. Now these children, of course, are victims of the conflict in Borno State, the Boko Haram insurgency, etc. But they've been in school now for about a year and a half, and they're exposed to the best, methods of training, many exposed to technology and all of that. And just looking at the results, looking at what they're able to do in a few short years, many of these kids, many of them had not even been to school before. Some had been in school and taken out of school during the insurgency. But several of them are able to write codes today. Several of them are even doing basic programming today in barely 2 years. So it just tells you that really what this is about is opportunity. Children anywhere, no matter how deprived, if they're given the right opportunities, can perform as well as children from the best backgrounds or from much better backgrounds. The last is that education, they say, promotes economic growth. As educational attainment, explain about half of the difference in growth between East Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, especially between the periods that they studied, between 1965 and 2010. So the real difference between us and the so-called Asian tigers, is first education, that investment was made in education. The President Buhari, set the tone for our renewed emphasis on human capital development in his speech while inaugurating the National Economic Council on June 20th, 2019. He said, and I quote, he said, "On education, I want to stress in particular the need to take very seriously and enforce very rigorously the provisions of the provisions of our law on free and compulsory education." Section 18(3) of the Constitution, as amended, says, and there is an obligation to eradicate illiteracy and provide free and compulsory education. Then it refers to Section 2 of our compulsory free universal basic education act, which provides that every government in Nigeria shall provide free, compulsory, and universal basic education for every child of primary and junior secondary school age. That's the first 9 years. And then he goes on to say that it's indeed a crime for any parent to keep his child out of school for that period, for that 9-year period. And in my view, when a government fails to provide the schools, teacher, and teaching materials necessary for basic education, it is actually aiding and abetting that crime. So as far as the federal government is concerned, as far as the president is concerned, free compulsory education in the first 9 years of a child's life is a serious matter. Indeed, as he says, it's a crime to even flout the policy. And so the thrust of the federal government in the next few years is to ensure that we work with other tiers of government to enforce that policy of free and compulsory education. This is the policy response that we have to the almost 10 million out-of-school children. And this is a phenomenon that occurs all over the country, this question of out-of-school children. So many children out of school across the various zones. And I am not so sure whether we have it. Yeah, we have a slide up there that shows some of the figures of number of out-of-school children. As I said, we must disaggregate in order to better understand what exactly is going on. Because sometimes when you say 10 million children out of school, it doesn't really show where those numbers are. But these are the first 6 states that have the largest number of out-of-school children. Kano is top, Akwa Ibom is second, Katsina, Kaduna, Taraba, and Sokoto are but that's just in order of the largest number of out-of-school children. As I said, this is it is across the country. It's not across the different zones. Of course, it will appear to be more in some of the northern states, more children out of school. But when you look at relative to population of the children, then you'll find that, in some states where you have smaller numbers, relative to their population is actually very large. Because if you compare Akwa Ibom, for instance, to Kano, I mean, Akwa Ibom is obviously, in terms of population, much smaller than Kano. Yet it has this very high number. So, if you look at the relative terms, you'll find that, we're really dealing with major problems in several parts of the country. We have, of course, the whole list of states, but I think that this just suffices to show us exactly where we're at in that. Indeed, the scale of the problem is that it is not only in terms of numbers, but also in terms of geographical access to schools. I mean, we're just looking at the problem. It's not just out-of-school children. There's also access. I mean, there are several settlements and hamlets all over the country where you cannot really expect that to establish a school there with all of the different facilities. So access sometimes is a problem, and of course funding. But even with children in school, pass rates, for example, in WAEC, have improved considerably now, but the average is still about 40%. This is with a curriculum that we are not satisfied with, the curriculum that we all agree isn't adequate. But the pass rate is about 40%. If you just look at this graph, it just shows from 2010, where average pass rate in WAEC was about 25%. It goes all the way up. I think 2017 was the highest, down slightly down to 50% in 2018. So it's not, the general average is about 40%, which isn't great. I mean, in the days when you and I went to school, 40% pass rate in WAEC was, and in fact, even 70% pass rate was considered a disaster in most schools. But if you look at what we're experiencing now, obviously the problems are quite major. But another sore point is that of education of girls, with some studies today showing that girls are even much smarter than boys. Any nation that does not educate its girls does itself great harm. How do you solve your problems when you lock your best minds up? And education of girls, of course, all the studies show that not only is it sound economics, it makes sound sense for us if you are looking at economic growth, because obviously this, as some studies show, a smarter group of individuals are even men. But what is even more important is that with the population growth at the moment, one of the major reasons why we have large population growth is because of early marriages and because many of these girls are not educated. Many of the studies show, for instance, that if you educate girls, you can actually reduce the population by almost 1% of where it is today, the rate of population growth. So when we're even panicking about the rate of our population growth, which is just under 3% now, slightly higher than our GDP figures. So just by educating girls, we could actually reduce the rate of growth and bring it within more manageable limits. So we have a threefold plan to improve educational outcomes. But more importantly, how to train this generation of students to create and function in a knowledge-driven economy. So to start with, we'll be more focused, and this is the first part of the plan, we are more focused on achieving the educational outcomes specified in the Sustainable Development Goals, such that we can meet the targets for school enrollment, which is very important, quality of education, adult literacy, and the quality of teaching, and the target is 2030. Secondly, as I've indicated earlier, we have, with the collaboration of state governments, undertaken an ambitious program to get the over 10 million out-of-school children into school. This will, of course, be helped by the President's June 20th declaration. Let me just explain that first, the vehicle for getting the collaboration of the states is the National Economic Council, where we've held so far about 3 major meetings, or summits if you like, on this issue of out-of-school children, looking at the figures, looking at all of the relevant details. How many schools are there in the particular state? How many teachers do they have? To what extent are they, faithful to the curriculum, etc.? Just looking at some of the specific issues per state. So the way to do this and the way we're going about it is by disaggregating and paying attention to the particular states and how to deal with the individual problems of each state. But it's a complex process because it requires the full cooperation of state governments and religious authorities in some parts of the country in particular. A lot of focus at some point was paid on the northern part of the country, and we're still paying quite a bit of attention. But it will be foolhardy to imagine that this is a northern problem, because as you've seen from the figures, and if you look at all of the figures comprehensively in relative terms, practically every zone has a significant problem of out-of-school children, including the Southwest, which used to be educationally advanced. But today the Southwest also suffers significantly, the Southeast also, although the Southeast actually leads in terms of, I think, completion of education and all of that. But still the relative numbers, when you look at the population to the relative numbers, is really quite significant. So, of course, there are also problems with resources to build schools, to equip them properly, and train the required number of teachers. Our school feeding program is already leading to improved enrollment, and the Empower program can be a source of the initial requirement for teachers. Just let me very quickly explain that. Our school feeding program has managed to get many of the children to school. So we have much higher enrollment. Once you start school feeding, the enrollment figures go up very, very significantly. In some places, as much as 40%. So enrollment, for instance, in Kano went up by almost 40%, in Kaduna also by almost 40%, in some cases about 25%, because of public primary schools. And just feeding children encourages their parents to send them to school, and the kids also want to go to school. So we have, because of the school feeding program, we now have a significant problem of even getting of more classrooms. The classrooms are now, you need bigger classrooms, you need more classrooms in order to just accommodate the children. So the program has certainly exceeded expectations, in terms of what we're seeing, and overcrowding, as I've said, of classrooms has presented another set of problems. Of course, this constrains the ability of children to learn. But what our latest figures show is that we have about 22.4 million children in 406,000 classrooms. This is in public primary schools across the country. This is about 56 children per class. But, this almost doubles the accepted, 30 children per class. So because of the overcrowding that we have already, we simply have to find the resources to build additional classrooms across the country so that our children, and perhaps in our case, in the case of this distinguished group of people, our grandchildren, can learn in optimal conditions. But more importantly, we're also redesigning our education curriculum. I'm going to talk again a bit more about this whole question of what to do where you have millions of children and you have few classrooms, and what we're doing with technology and what we can do. But more importantly, as I said, we need to redo our educational curriculum as part of our educational roadmap. Our roadmap is called Every Child Counts, and it's quite clear that we have to change both the substance of education that our children receive as well as the methods by which they are educated. We're clear that the key to achieving our objectives is to focus on what we describe as STEAM as opposed to STEM, but I will explain that also. STEAM, of course, is science, education, technology, education, technology, and maths. And we say that in addition to that, we've added arts. That's why it's called STEAM as opposed to STEM. And we think that there is a need for a workforce with STEM skills to drive economic prosperity. Lagos State University was recently described or was recently conferred with the status of a center of excellence for working on STEM research, on developing STEM, this method of learning or this method of teaching, and since it's become a center of excellence, it has also been able to supply some of the needed research materials for developing the curriculum around STEM, the teaching of STEM. But just to explain what STEM itself means, what does STEM mean? It is really, as I've said, science, technology, engineering, arts, and maths. But how does this work? The way that it works is that it is no longer teaching science, technology, engineering, and maths as individual subjects, but more as a system of thought. And everywhere where it's been tried, it is really done as a system of thought, so that you're actually teaching all of this as one thing in order to solve problems, to resolve many of the issues that there are. So it's a transformative system of education. And the only way to do it is how, of course, it's been done elsewhere. And some of the examples we've seen are really quite good. For example, in Borno State, they've done quite a bit of work in Borno State. I actually was able to see some of the classrooms where they're using some of this, where they're using some of the technology that is useful in STEM research. And what they've tried to do, basically, is just using smart boards, which are very cheap, by the way, not expensive, and some of the teachers are already trained, looking at, so for example, in teaching physics, where you are teaching, say, gravitation, so there's a picture of an apple falling, the Newton theory of the apple falling, and questions that's asked, and this is animated, questions asked about, okay, so how come the apple is falling downwards as opposed to going upwards? How come it can't go down? And just the graphics of it alone, is such a powerful tool for the teacher to convey to the student what gravitation, just the laws of gravity and what that means and how that works and all that. And this is really more the way of engagement, the way by which this STEM teaching works. And again, just looking at how it's worked in so many of these other places, if you ask the children a question, they can very quickly relate it to every other thing that they're doing. Unlike the learning of physics by rote, which basically is just a definition. What is gravitation? Or what is gravity? And you just have a definition. So now a much more practical, a much more interactive way of learning. We believe that training, we've added, as I said, arts to it. So we believe that training in humanities is fundamental also to sound reasoning and judgment. And we must also take on the challenge of training men and women for opportunities in arts and the entertainment. So I've explained already what STEM is. I've already gone into some explanation of that. But the reason why this is especially important is because we believe that technology and computing for several decades to come will rule the world. And you cannot get children trained to think, in terms of technology and to use computing effectively without STEM, without this sort of education, without looking at science, technology, engineering, and maths, and even the arts as one whole system of thought and teaching children in that way. So every aspect of our lives, whether it is healthcare, commerce, business, education, entertainment, everything, as we all know, will be driven by some form of technology platform or the other. So technology itself is driven, as we know, by the interplay of all of these science, technology, engineering, and maths. So recognizing this, we've developed the curriculum, and we've adapted that curriculum also from what has been developed in other countries. And so we're no longer, the approach to teaching will be using this as a system of thought and ideas, as opposed to just teaching the subjects individually. Now, the teaching also emphasizes how to use the combination of these subjects to design, to solve real-life problems. Most surveys on job opportunities of the future agree that STEM-related jobs in computing will dominate the job market. The good news is, for us here, is that even in Europe and America, there are huge gaps in finding competent persons to take on most of the tech-related jobs already being created. So, most of these computing jobs don't even require degrees anyway. They require some form of certification, and just on the flight here today, we're talking about badges, which is what they give for competence these days, not even certification as such. So our new policy is to introduce science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics in primary and secondary schools. But we also recognize that schooling should support the development of skills in cross-disciplinary critical and critical thinking, digital technologies, etc. These skills are all essential in the 21st, for almost every 21st century occupation. So the national curriculum, which has been developed and which of course is being fine-tuned, will not only include the teaching of coding, digital arts, design thinking, robotics, critical thinking, and other skills, but also using these skills in interpreting traditional curriculum topics. As I said, you know, in several parts of the country already, a lot of work is going on in public primary schools and in some cases public secondary schools on some of these curriculum, on some of the features of this curriculum. The federal government's aim is to ensure that from early education, primary school onwards, regardless of social background or geographical location, every young person should have a fundamental level of digital and STEM literacy that enables them to succeed locally or internationally. So the curriculum is one of the most important components of the program's success. It recognizes the importance of having a well-rounded curriculum that is global in orientation and local in its application. So quality teaching is the key, in my view, to lifting the Nigerian student skill quotient so as to attain this whole national objective. Teachers need to be equipped with the skills and the confidence to support digital literacy. Functional skills training and STEM learning, we need to equip our teachers. So our efforts under the national strategy will focus on implementing national retraining at the primary school and secondary levels, implementing national initial teacher education standards, sharing best practices and efforts to attract more STEM graduates to the teaching profession, and then creating conducive learning environments, which of course is crucial to motivating students and enhancing learning. Classrooms and other learning centers must also be remodeled. So we're remodeling now and re-equipping 10,000 schools every year. And as I said, this is working with the state governments for the next 10 years. We believe that re-equipping classrooms, 10,000 a year, we should be able to accomplish a significant percentage of what our challenges are within the next 10 years. We expect that STEM will fundamentally determine the future of the Nigerian socio-economic landscape. We're in a race against other economies and against time. Technology has changed the employment landscape permanently. For the first time, as they say, in human history, men and women will be trained in their own countries, work even from their own bedrooms, and compete for jobs anywhere on the planet. Computing is the ultimate, as they say, the ultimate agnostic tool. You may never even have to see your employer, or the employee or service provider. But our success or failure will determine our economic future. But how about the resource challenges? And of course, there are many resource challenges. One of the critical things that I want to say about this is that it's incredible how, how easy it is to do a lot of what we're talking about. And if you look at teacher qualifications today, it's in general, very, very poor in terms of just skills. Very poor. But why is that the case? It's because we've not developed a systematic way of passing information on to teachers, of training teachers. We have not developed a systematic way. Now, how are we going to develop that systematic way? We found with our experiments with MPOWER, which is our program under the Social Investment Program, where we have engaged 500,000 young people, young graduates. We found that it's not so difficult to train. So each, about the 250,000 of them have a device like this that has training material on it. We also have an open portal where they can go to take training material. Almost 2/3 of this, our MPOWER graduates who we've engaged teach already in public primary schools in local governments across the country. Their devices have the material, teaching material, lessons, and all sorts of things that they use. In fact, in some local governments, only MPOWER, the teachers that they have, the graduate teachers they have, are MPOWER people. And just going around and looking at what they're doing, it's not so difficult, especially when a person has basic education, to teach a bit more. And where you are teaching using science and technology in particular, and teaching skills that are not just learning by rote, it's even easier to do so. So we think that digital technology enables us to leapfrog in terms of teacher training, in terms of the quality of teacher training. And I think we can really achieve a lot. But what are the resource challenges? It's evident that even with the best effort, given resource constraints, and our population growth rate at 2.6%, we'll just have to think out of the box and introduce the use of technology and digital means to reach the massively growing number of children. This will also place a huge demand on resources, both at the national level and ensuring broadband coverage, also at the school level, in terms of obtaining computers and all that. We need broadband coverage across the entire country. Our national fiber coverage today is still low, with only about 46% of the population within 5-kilometer proximity to a fiber network, which means over 100 million of our people are still outside the fiber reach. But at the more granular level, only 3,600 public primary schools out of 63,400 have computers. So of the public primary schools that we have, just about 3,600 of them, of the 63,400, have computers at all. So the ratio is a bit better in the public junior secondary schools, where just over 1/3 have access to computers. Fortunately, we already have arrangements to support state governments in this area through the funds made available by UBEC as a first-line charge in the budget. The budgeted amount for UBEC in 2019 was 112.47 billion naira. When added to the 87 billion naira, which remains, it's close to about 200 billion, will be available to UBEC for basic interventions this year. So we'll be working closely with the states to enable them access UBEC funds so as to build schools, equip them appropriately, and then, of course, improve access generally. And we think that the amount of funding which they'll require can, of course, be supplemented by the state government. We expect that the state governments themselves will be active in co-funding some of the projects, some of the things that we've been talking about. Of course, we're also helping to review the conditionalities for accessing UB intervention funds by the states and the FCT, with the aim of increasing accountability. And we think that we will be able to make some impact once we're able to assist them in accessing UB funds. One of the things we've done is that when we're giving them the Paris Club refunds, when we're giving the states the Paris Club refunds, we insisted that a portion of the Paris Club refunds will be used to pay their counterpart funding for UBE funds. So we've already paid their counterpart funding. They can no longer complain about not having the counterpart funding to access their UBE funds. So there is, they have the access now. Some of the states of the Federation that have shown full or near access to UBEC intervention funds have also shown progress in infrastructure, teacher development, and teaching materials. With regard to digital infrastructure, we're already in discussions with relevant stakeholders to achieve 100% broadband coverage by 2023. So getting children to school and ensuring that they are instructed in the appropriate surroundings with the right equipment is just one part of the equation. We also have to ensure that they stay in school and are provided with suitable instruction, where that is the case. There's a slide on completion rates of schools. And if you just look at the completion rates, that's primary school enrollment. The Southeast has the highest enrollment in primary school, Southwest immediately after South-South goes all the way down, and the Northeast has the lowest enrollment. But primary school completion is more or less the same, follows more or less the same trend, except that completion is higher in the South-South than practically everywhere else. But again, you will see how completion sort of tapers down. So there are problems, of course, with enrollment. You know, even 61% enrollment isn't necessarily great. And what we should be looking at is 100% enrollment, which is the focus for primary schools, for primary school in the first 9 years. So while the completion rate for primary schooling is said to be, we looked at the percentage, junior secondary schools is about 42%. In fact, there is greater gender imbalance at this level, with female completion in particular is just 34%. So the female completion rate is much, much lower, on the average than general completion, because female completion is about 34%. So to keep children in school for the entire period of basic education, in addition to providing free public education and enforcing mandatory attendance, we'll be using the evidence of completion of the first 3 years of secondary school for participating in the Empower program, which is Empower, especially for the non-graduate apprenticeship schemes. So one of the things we are planning to do is that in order to encourage people to stay in school and to, if you're going to go into the Empower non-graduate scheme, we want to see that you went to school for the first 3 years of secondary school at the very least. And that's what we call our Empower Build, which consists of automobile technicians training, carpentry training, plumbing, masonry, electrical technicians, welding, bakers, confectioners, caterers, cooks, etc. And all of these, we already have a scheme, we already have our Empower scheme for non-graduates, but we haven't discriminated. But we are putting in these conditions now to encourage more people to ensure that they go through at least the first 3 years of junior secondary. How about improving educational outcomes? I'm coming to the end of this. Evidence from around the world and even domestically has shown that the quality of educational outcomes is very much dependent on the quality of teaching. And we've emphasized this. Almost 1/3 of teaching staff in public primary schools don't have the right qualifications, while it's about half in private primary schools. So even private primary schools are not doing particularly well. One would have expected that private schools would be better resourced than public schools. But some of the countries that we've seen clearly show that where you have better training of teachers, then obviously you are likely to have much, much better educational outcomes by far. In fact, in some cases, you don't even need to have the schools. If you have a good teacher and is teaching even under a tree, you are more likely to have better educational outcomes, and if you have all the nice infrastructure and you don't have a good teacher. So it is so evident that the quality of teachers is one of the most crucial things that can be done in all of our educational experience. So some of the countries that we have studied, as I've said, showed that placed with high-performing teachers, anywhere where you have high-performing teachers, where you have good quality teachers, almost 3 times, the quality of students is almost 3 times better than those with low-performing teachers. So So one of the things we've decided to do is the NC will be revamped to raise the caliber of new teachers and principals and to give continuous professional development to these teachers at the NCE level and link teacher training to the revised curriculum using a scripted approach. So we're going to link teacher training to this new curriculum so that, and there's a scripted approach, in other words, there's clarity as to what are being taught. And you can teach it anywhere. You don't need to go to a formal college of education in order to be able to teach some of these skills. We're working with relevant organizations and bodies to draw up recertification requirements, while working also with the Nigerian Teachers Institute to refine existing NCE qualifications and to raise the status of the teaching profession. This entire process will be supported by incentives such as recognition, improved pay for teachers, and opportunities for further professional development. Working closely with the states, I think that we can improve teacher capacity through mentoring. In addition to improving teacher capacity, we'll also be providing support to them by building an ecosystem that supports learning by teachers themselves. This requires engaging teachers through peer-led learning schemes, school headmasters, and various ministries of education. The intention is to give teachers a new experience about how they learn and how they learn to teach as well. The training will be to enable teachers to take a multidisciplinary approach to teaching and help to solve real-life problems. Some states have already started implementing programs such as this. For instance, in Edo State, they already have what is called the Edo Best program. And my office and the Ministry of Education is working with 4 states in the first instance to introduce a similar program. The Edo Best program was designed to upskill 1,500 public primary and junior secondary schools and train up to 15,000 teachers and impact on about 300,000 students. But in 1 year, the initiative has reached already 18 local governments in the state. It has touched 612 primary schools and trained and equipped 11,000 teachers. It's reached 150,000 school children and distributed up to about 1 million textbooks and instructional materials. With the training that my office is supervising and developing with the governments of Anambra, Borno, Ekiti, and Jigawa states, we aim to roll out an extensive program of training for teachers across the country over the next 4 years. Our experience with the school feeding program shows that the scale of this ambition is entirely achievable. If we are focused, in fact with our social investment programs generally, if we are focused and organized, there's no reason why we cannot roll out this teacher training program effectively across the country, especially using technology. Teacher experience will be complemented with teaching aids, instructional materials, and the greater use of technology. Already, Empower, some 200,000 graduates have already spoken about that, have been given instructional materials on their devices, and they use this to structure their lessons, plan, etc. Learning assessments and performance and management processes can also be deployed. I think that there is plenty of room and plenty of opportunity to build. So, friends, ladies and gentlemen, I believe that you and I belong to an idealistic generation. We had, and we still have, great hopes for our nation. We probably have one of the lowest numbers of those who chose to live abroad. I'm sure that most of us who are here are not diasporans. We lived here in Nigeria. And we believed from the days when we were in school that being successful here in Nigeria means, and it still means the world to us as far as we are concerned. Success can only be measured when you are here in this country, and it's true. So we are forever discussing Nigeria. Most of us are forever discussing Nigeria. We've become experts on practically everything Nigeria. Our chat groups are on fire on every issue. Our nation's journey may sometimes appear disappointing, at various points. Indeed, the task of nation building, I'm sure many of us recognize this, sometimes appears recursive. So 1 step forward, 2 steps backwards. But all we need are a few determined men and women who keep focused until we leave this earth. I think that that's what nation building calls for. It calls for continuous focus. I'm just listening to Mr. Nwofo and the research that he's doing, and the time and energy that he's spending privately with his own resources to do some of this research. It's a sort of commitment that we need. We can't sit around and say, well, this country is just going, somehow, this country will grow. I do not know any other country where people have become experts on practically everything, from power to education, whatever. We are the experts. Nigerians, every Nigerian knows practically everything. So let us, join forces in doing some of what we need to do. The challenge today, especially in human capital development, calls for help in thinking and action from all of us. And we're never too old to participate actively in public service. The president is 76 years old, still in public service. And he has good support. Trump is 73, Biden is 76, Nancy Pelosi is 79, the Mahathir Mohamad of Malaysia is 93 years old. So how old are you guys? I mean, I really think that we should work together on this. Thank you very much.